Hey gang, Dr. G, Imaginarium. Today I'm going to talk about the inner healer versus something I'm calling Nurture-Mania. I'm going to start off with what I mean by Nurture-Mania, and then that'll lead me to what I'm talking about when I say that we have an inner healer. So, what is Nurture-Mania? It's a term I'm coining for our what I think is essentially a cognitive bias to explain the way that we're feeling or things that emerge within us as attributable to some kind of external cause. So, and I see this all the time. So, what I mean is, if I'm feeling a certain way, I tend to look at some particular event, say, or some particular thing that I learned, and then I'll say, "Oh, that must be what caused that." I see this in folks even who are basically giving, evidence of a first psychotic break. What they and their family will tend to do in that instance is they'll look at some event that happened to them and they'll say, well, that was really hard on them. And so that's why they started hearing voices or they started thinking that they were being followed by monitors or the government or whatever it is. Now, in psychiatry, of course, we know better than this. And we know that that's not really how that works. If that were the case, then anytime anybody had some kind of severe trauma, we'd be seeing that a whole lot more often than we do. And in fact, schizophrenia is a essentially neurodevelopmental disorder that has a very strong genetic component to it. So what's really happening in this instance has very little to do with what actually is going on in their lives and more to do with the natural evolution of the way that their mind is operating due to variables that are involved in their brain functioning. So this, what I'm calling nurture mania or nurture bias, though, is something that's quite pervasive, and I've seen it a lot in psychology as well. Thankfully, this is changing for the most part, but for a long time, psychology attributed pretty much every sort of what we might call mental disorder to some sort of early event, particularly childhood event. And one of the problems with this, of course, a lot of times it's very difficult to disprove this sort of thing. Like, and one example being, for example, that schizophrenia was often given given an explanation that it had something to do with attachments in childhood. They would call it the double bind, or autism being called by so-called refrigerator mothers. These, I think, explanations are appealing because just subjectively, when we look back on our lives, we tend to think mainly of our own experiences and the events that forged those experiences, and we don't give much thought to what's going on underneath the surface. So whenever something's going on in life, if we feel a certain way, we tend to take a look at, well, what happened in my story? Why did I learn to feel this way? Why did I learn to do this or that? But I think that's a problem. It's a problem because if we automatically assume that everything that's in there has to do with something that we learned, then it means that what would naturally occur anyway is being missed. We're not looking at that. And there are many, many, many examples of that latter type of behavior existing. Just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, think about the diving reflex. So the diving reflex is triggered if you jump into water and you get your face wet. It triggers a whole suite of physiological changes, such as shifting the blood inward, a releasing of red blood cells from the spleen, slowing the heart rate, shifts in metabolism, et cetera, et cetera. This happens if you just immerse your face in water. You don't actually have to dive in, and this occurs across species. It's called the mammalian diving reflex, actually. So now you might ask, okay, so what? That's a reflex. It's an instinct. Okay, well then that means that it's built in, essentially, or it's innate. But isn't it kind of an amazing coincidence that it works out like that? You could easily ask, well, where did you learn to do that? When did your body learn that it needs to shift its metabolism like that, and so forth and so on? But of course, the answer is that it doesn't. It's already there. It has to do with our ancestral history. So it's easy to miss the significance of things like this. it's easy to miss the fact that what this means is that the genome essentially has a set of built-in responses to commonly encountered environmental situations. Now, the example I'm giving you here is a very physiological one, but obviously I think that applies to more psychological responses. As we know, mind and body are one. They're not artificially separatable. And so I think that certain frequently encountered psychosocial situations likely have a very similar response. We've already talked about one in previous videos on mysteries of the psyche here, and that would be the conserved transcriptional response to adversity. So you can check out those videos there for more about that. That's essentially an immune response to psychosocial variables. So that's one example that's emerged. There's others too that I'm going to talk about on this series of videos on my channel. But the bottom line is, if you're always looking for what kind of experiential antecedent and not the particularly specific way that the body and or the mind respond to those particular experiences, then you're losing half the picture. And again, let me use the analogy of the diving reflex again. You could look at this and say, oh, well, diving causes this, and that's it. But then you're missing the fact that the reflex is there and the response is there in order to promote survival in a species that happens to be an air-breathing species. Okay, so if you're looking at that, and if you don't think about this as an innate response, as an inner protective response, you're missing the fact that there is a whole host of these kinds of things going on within the mind that are essentially designed to help, or at least attempt to promote survival on some level. Now, I think this is very interesting when you start talking about psychotherapy, because within psychotherapy there has been a rather long-standing debate as to whether or not the therapist actually fixes the patient or client, or whether or not we simply catalyze their own inner healing responses. Now, I obviously lean heavily on the latter version of this, and for many reasons I've already given in other videos here. But it is interesting that we're still debating this, and I don't really think we should. I think the evidence is strong enough that we can say once and for all that the idea of the therapist is not to go in and through their actions or words or teaching or whatever it is, change and fix people that are experiencing struggles. Rather, what our job is to unlock, disentangle, or decompress their own inner healing processes. Now, this latter way of looking at therapy is prominent in actually quite a few different psychotherapy schools. I think one of the ones that's impressed me the most is the psychosystems analysis that I've talked about here. There's a link below here that you can go to their channel, Young to Live By. It's a great channel. This is an element of Jungian therapy, and especially, but you also see this in Gestalt therapy and many types of somatic therapy. And it's really basically looking at the hypothesis that there is a inner healing process that we're born with. And generally, when we're having symptoms, it's because this process is interrupted in some way and or needs help from ego consciousness, to help motivate it or move it forward so that we can heal, so we can get into a more integrated state. Okay. So what that means then is that essentially symptoms or even spontaneous symbols and images like dreams are many times, not always, but many times, our own body's attempts at adaptation, much like the diving reflex. We're encountering a very commonly encountered psychosocial situation, and these symbols and images will emerge as the body's attempt, or you could say the unconscious or the non-ego consciousness, however you want to frame this, as those are attempts at healing. Now, what about these social behaviors then? what might trigger something like this. I think loneliness, challenges with attachment, jealousy, pride, envy, love, all of these universally human things are they're very strongly emotional responses. They, if learning is involved, it's really only involved in modifying these responses. You don't learn to feel love. We just have a natural, strong proclivity to feel love and attachment towards others. It's part of our whole survival repertoire, is latching onto each other and creating communities. Now, I talk a lot about that here on this channel. But when we face threats to that, when we face conflicts and challenges to that, I believe that the genome has answers to that, and they manifest themselves within the psyche, within the ego psyche, as these images, spontaneously erupting images and symbols, also in affects as well. So, bottom line, I believe that what nurture does is very important, because it can modify how we respond to these sorts of things. It's the equivalent of saying that we all have this diving reflex, say, but that when you do a lot of diving, it becomes more attuned because of the experiences. That's how nature and nurture work together. They're not opposing forces. They operate in combination. Now, what does all this mean then? What this means is that, if I'm right, which I give lots of explanations and reasons for why I think I'm right here on this channel, it means that we have an inner healing process. It's wanting us to integrate. It's wanting us to be able to adjust to our environments, and also to adjust to inner conflicts and help to grow past them or resolve them in some cases. And sometimes they simply need to be grown past rather than resolved, but that's a nuance. Nevertheless, I can't force somebody to do those sorts of things, and I don't create that magic by myself. It's already there. I'm there to try to help a person get more in tune with that sort of thing when I'm doing therapy with folks. The medications actually do these sorts of things as well. As we're learning more and more about how they work, they actually operate on our own naturally appearing healing systems. So it means that, though, that the inner healer is not a learned, it itself is not a learned process. It is an innate process that is adaptable to different types of learning and modifiable by certain types of learning. The inner healing process is not culturally constructed. It's culturally modified. So maybe the next time that you hear about people explaining their symptoms, or if you happen to wonder about how you're feeling, remember that I think one of the natural things for us to do is immediately attribute it to some sort of event that happened to us and say that, well, we learned it then or there or whatever it is, when that may not actually be the case. And it may be even that things like depression or anxiety may be attempts at healing or integration. And it's worth looking into that with your therapist or a pastoral counselor, whoever you're working with. Don't try to do this alone. And explore that option. Explore that with someone that you really trust. Okay, so that's what I've got for you today. Make sure you like and subscribe, all that stuff. Make sure you drop by ericgoodwyn.com, where you can see some more of the stuff I've been up to lately. And keep an eye open for the new book cover reveal for my upcoming fantasy novel, King of the Forgotten Darkness. Until then, I'll see you next time, gang.